I have been grateful to have worked with many of you and our organizations over the years on the Pause Act, Be Heard Act, and most recently, securing nearly $100 million to house homeless DV victims, including $43 million in new funding. We celebrate these successes, but we know there is much more to do. And the pandemic has provided even more challenges to addressing the issues of domestic and intimate partner violence. I look forward to continuing our partnership as we work together to create healthier and safer future for our communities. And I am excited to be joined by an incredible panel of experts and advocates on domestic and intimate partner violence. We have Laura Vanzant from REACH, Cecia Sanchez from Casa Myrna, Santiago Taylor from BARC, Hema Sarong Simensky from Jane Doe, and Jassy Senwa of Transition House. So we are going to start today by hearing from my friend, Laura Vanzant. Laura has worked as an executive director for Reach Beyond Domestic Violence since October of 2004. In this role, she is responsible for all aspects of operating a multi-service domestic violence agency, providing emergency services and community education. The agency has more than doubled in size in the last decade, currently operating with 20 full and part-time staff. REACH provides assistance to over 6,000 people each year with direct services and education. Laura, we will try to begin on a positive note. Could you share where you think you have seen the most growth on this issue? And where do you think we have the most work to do? Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Congresswoman Clark. Really a pleasure to be here with you, especially after hearing you talk this morning to the local chambers and with all of my colleagues. I think probably in the 15, 16 years that I've been doing this, one of the things that I've appreciated on my own learning curve is how this work has continued to evolve from a responsive structure, an emergency structure, to one that is really committed to fostering the change that I think all of us are committed to. I think each and every one of us get into this work because we are looking to make change in the world. And we do that work alongside all the life-saving and life-changing work that's happening every day. I'm excited about a lot of the efforts that are happening in communities organizing around this issue. I'm also excited to see a lot of the thoughtfulness that's coming to our response model. That something that I think we all know is that so many survivors actually do not engage with law enforcement. Some do so against their will. And the structures that we've all built are inclusive of partnering with law enforcement, but don't exclusively rely on that. And so there's a lot of work that we do side by side with survivors, not involve a police response. And so I think I'm really heartened to see how all of us have listened to the voices of survivors in terms of crafting the variety of ways that we could be a resource to individuals, families, and their communities. So.
That's wonderful. Thank you again, not only for your work, for being with us today. And next, I'd like to introduce Cecia Sanchez. Cecia has served as the Director of Housing Programs at Casa Myrna since July of 2018. and Casa Myrna delivers solutions to end domestic and dating violence through intervention, awareness, and prevention. The organization was named for Myrna Vasquez, an actress and activist who organized members of South End's Puerto Rican community. Today, Casa Myrna is Boston's largest provider of domestic violence awareness efforts and of shelter and supportive services to domestic violence survivors. Their comprehensive range of services available in Spanish and English provide survivors with the tools to recover from the trauma of abuse. Each year, they serve nearly 1,000 survivors through residential programs, housing assistance, financial literacy, legal advocacy, and community-based advocacy. Cecia, thank you for joining us today. And could you talk about the challenges of housing, both generally and how that has changed during COVID? And what looming challenges do you anticipate as the pandemic persists, furthering stressing the housing problem?
Well, thank you so much first for having me here and having this roundtable available so like that we can all chat and talk about all the issues that we all see. Um, the housing crisis has been so ongoing, especially in the Boston, even in Massachusetts, and for homeless families. I have seen so much amazing things happening during COVID and so much more fundings when it comes into housing and Section 8 vouchers that we had never seen before. That the city was able to launch 1,000 vouchers through Boston Housing and BPS. But those vouchers will only benefit those families who had children in the Boston public school systems. And or homelessness is a lot more than that. And we have a lot more other families that have not benefit from it. I know that right now the city is about to do 500 more for project-based Section 8 vouchers. That's something else that is going to be great to be able for the families who are in homelessness to be able to experience that. The same with rapid rehousing fundings have increased so much, and the city have been able to organize themselves pretty well to move families as soon as possible out of homelessness now with COVID more than ever. And I think those are great things that are happening. But what's going to happen after COVID, right? I feel these fundings have been available or could have been done before COVID. But now that the emergency happened is when the lights being shined and it's being seen like it's just like an emergency right now, but it's not. It has been an emergency before COVID and what's going to happen after COVID. So to be able to see and hopefully we can continue advocating to be able to have a lot more vouchers for Section 8, project-based, low income resources for apartments for families who are experiencing homelessness ongoing and not just when the crisis occurs will be amazing, right? I think that we all can say that the domestic violence shelters have been built for emergency from 3 to 6 months to be able to stabilize the family. And we have been for years now seeing that the families are there for a year, for 2 years, for 3 years, because there's not permanent housing. It's no more that they need the emergency state. They was offered in the beginning of the safety. Right now it's because there's nowhere for them to really go into something that is going to be permanent for them in low income, right? So hopefully we're able to move from that in the future and create programs and initiative for housing that are able to actually have the domestic violence shelter be something that is a 3 or 6 month stay for a family and for a child so they can secure permanent housing.
Yeah, thank you for that. And very timely reminder, these are not new problems and the emergency solutions are not going to be the end of the story of how we get to safer communities. So Thank you. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Katia Santiago Taylor. Katia is the Policy Director and Manager of Legislative Affairs for the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center. In this role, she advocates for system-wide policy changes to support survivors and manages BARC's work on legislation that affects them. Katia has worked in the field of domestic and sexual violence since 1999. Before joining BARC in 2013, she worked in various positions at MOVA and also as a victim witness advocate for the Suffolk and Middlesex District Attorney's Office. Born and raised in Puerto Rico, Katia has a master's degree from Northeastern in criminal justice. Katia, it is great to have you here with us, and I'm hoping you can share some of your thoughts on what you've seen during the pandemic with respect to sexual violence in our communities and campuses.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and for everyone in the panel. It's so great to be with all of you here. So what we have seen is a little bit different. We see a lot of isolation. We have seen a lot of survivors trying to navigate difficult systems while not being able to be socially in the same place or physically together. Accessing services have become a little bit more difficult. Most of the services are available, but they're virtual now. So that removes the touch, the physical connection, or the accessibility for survivors and service providers. What we are seeing too is that healing of sexual trauma looks very differently now. And we're beginning to learn that survivors have their own way to heal and that we're here to support them. And we knew that healing doesn't always look the same, but we're beginning to be more creative in creating different spaces, creating this different groups, making different services available. Between the isolation and the contact and the access that some perpetrators can have on survivors, it can make it even more difficult to manage, right? Because if you're in the same space with your abuser, you have no room to separate yourself. So as a rape crisis center, what we have been able to do is sort of become creative and try to support survivors where they are at and update the services. Our medical advocacy program can no longer go to the hospital because of COVID in the emergency room, but we have tablets, and now we're providing the services virtually. We're running groups at BARC because we know survivors still need them. And it's a good way to be socially interactive, connecting, and supporting survivors through their healing. So I think access is still there. Sexual violence is still happening. It's still happening within the context of domestic violence, intimate partner, and non-intimate partners. And is how we support survivors to manage their healing process and encourage them to figure out what works for them, speak up, and so we providers can help them in that healing process, because we know it looks differently for everyone.
Well, thank you for that. And one of the things I admire about all the organizations represented and all the incredible women on this panel is the flexibility and continuing to meet the needs in a very challenging time in the best of situations. So just thank you for that and for all the work you're doing in this unfortunate crisis of this pandemic. Next, I'd like to introduce Hema Sarong Simensky. Hema serves as the Policy Director for Jane Doe, Inc., working closely with GDI members and numerous partnerships and collaborations to assess and improve how policies and systems respond to survivors and their communities across the state. Hema supports GDI members in advocating for funding and legislative changes to help survivors. Hema, thank you for joining us, and we'd love to hear more about your work and what policy changes you are advocating for on the state level.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to be here and just for your tireless support of survivors across the Commonwealth. We just deeply appreciate it. It's so lovely to have a champion for programs and for survivors. So thank you for that. I appreciate your comment about the flexibility, because I think when I think about systems and policy spaces that we are really looking to making change, it really comes from the wonderful input of our member programs. We have 59 member programs and a variety of stakeholders outside of our coalition as well. And to be able to identify amidst a pandemic the gaps that not only existed prior to the pandemic, but also were so just so highlighted. When we talk about these dueling pandemics of systemic racism and of the pandemic itself, I think that there was a way in which, programs across the Commonwealth really sprung into action to dive deep into what those gaps were and to identify those gaps, to increase responsiveness, to use all of the creativity of, from those crisis response skills that came in handy in coming up with creative ways to make sure services were available and open to survivors really from day one of the closure. And that was so powerful to see happen. I just want to highlight a couple areas in terms of policy and systems advocacy directions that we are seeing, especially highlighted as a result of those dual pandemics that I think we are so familiar with these days. Like Cecia and others have said, the gaps in the ability to provide services for survivors were already there prior to the pandemic. I mean, we had done a survey of our member programs that highlighted, 63% of programs going back a couple of years ago were unable to meet the needs that were coming in to provide services. A vast and a huge percentage of that was related to housing advocacy, certainly as we've been talking about the housing crisis. And also a significant gap in ability to provide services to limited English proficient survivors. That's become a real interest and really magnified by the pandemic as we see sort of limitations in accessing courts. What does it mean to be able to access courts, other systems, agencies when you are limited English proficient? While in some ways access has expanded for some survivors because, we actually just got some data from a program that talked about, engagement is up in so many ways, but we have to also ask the question of engagement of which survivors and who's being left out of that engagement. So we've been really looking to increasing our advocacy around looking at language-based marginalization and what that looks like for survivors who are limited English proficient in the Commonwealth. What is the responsibility of the Commonwealth to provide additional services in that respect? What does it mean to be able to envision a world where survivors have trauma-informed access to quality interpreters to get the services they need? And so we're doing some, coalition building, doing some survey work with our member programs and various stakeholders to get there. It's one piece that I really wanted to highlight, and we're following some state legislation that's looking into that area as well. I feel like on the housing front, there's this this issue of affordable housing that I think feels sometimes intractable, especially in a place like Massachusetts. And that said, the creativity that I think we spoke of has really been wonderful in, we were able to use some of our CARES Act funding to foster a partnership between the Department of Public Health, Casa Mirna, Pilch and Associates and the Governor's Council on Domestic and Sexual Violence to create this collaboration that was really going to look to bridging the gaps, looking at what is keeping survivors from accessing housing. Yes, there's an affordable housing crisis, but are there other kinds of partnerships that can be built to help programs connect with housing providers in to provide more wraparound services? And what are the range of opportunities that exist to do what we can with the resources we have and build partnerships and foster those relationships between programs and housing providers. So that's been an exciting, it's called Safe Housing. We're really excited to be working on it with a bunch of incredible folks. And so that's one direction. And I think, certainly in terms of policy successes and directions, we are really, I think as Laura had raised earlier, looking at some of the intersections between, what does it mean to be providers, working with sexual assault and domestic violence survivors who have differing experiences with criminal justice system responses. And what is our obligation as providers to widen the scope of services that we can offer? So we're looking at, some of the unique issues that survivors who might themselves have criminal histories, as is so common. What does that mean? What are some systems advocacy or legislative solutions that we can look to improve outcomes for those survivors? So many things. And on the federal level, we're very excited to see movement around VAWA reauthorization, conversations, increasing culturally specific funding for survivors to really, again, highlight the unique approaches and needs for survivors who are at the intersections of so many forms of oppression, and just the huge benefit of culturally specific, linguistically specific services for survivors. So excited about that, and really championing the VOCA fix, which I know you've been such a strong supporter of over time to get much needed funds to programs who are receiving VOCA funds. So just some highlights.
Well, those are just wonderful highlights. And thank you, Hema, for, and this is reflected in all of your work, that at this moment of really racial reckoning in our country, that you have been meeting that need, making sure that all your work is done through a lens of equity and racial justice and cultural competency. We're very grateful, and it was good to hear about your even further work and expansion of that to make sure that access is meaningful to everybody. And our final panelists, last but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce Cecia Senwa. Cecia joined Transition House in 2015, and she recently became the Director of Housing Services for the organization. She oversees the organization's housing continuum that includes shelter, transitional, and permanent housing options for survivors of domestic violence. Cecia earned her master's in Crime and Justice Studies and Public Administration from Suffolk University, and she, prior to joining Transition House, worked for the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office as a victim witness advocate and as a shelter coordinator for 2 other agencies providing shelter services to families overcoming homelessness and domestic violence. Cecia grew up in Liberia, West Africa, where she watched and helped her grandmother run an orphanage home for children who had lost their parents during the Civil War. Cecia, it is great to have you here, and I am hoping you would be able to discuss your work in the context of the pandemic and why it's so important that we invest in these continuum of care programs to provide the vital services that are needed. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Congresswoman Clark. It's great to, be here with some colleagues that we see. We've been doing this work for a year now, working through the pandemic, but we know, I think one of my colleagues said that the pandemic just made everything a little more visible, but these issues have always been there. They will continue to be there once we get the pandemic, under somewhat of a control. Working in the residential programs, when you hear the stories about funding, when you hear the stories about policy, everything, and those are all amazing work. But seeing the families, seeing the people who are impacted every single day by the things we go to work to do and the difference we go to make, at times it can certainly be overwhelming. At times it can certainly be draining. When you see a family in shelter who may have lost their job during the pandemic, and then schools are closed, so now children are home and you are in, a 12 by 14 bedroom, and you're sort of stuck there now, right? You have no access to whether it's the medical facilities or counseling or, doctors and everything else. And you're still in this space, and there's staff who have to work remotely. So that removes another layer of contact that you had to be able to get through all the things you have to face, the trauma and everything else. And you see people becoming more depressed. This is where isolation and everything happen. People are just more triggered, and you talking about shelter where there's 9 families in there and everyone have to go through that. You're also looking at food shortages, right? Because the pandemic happened, our partners could not deliver food like they would. And then again, kids are home from school. We know kids eat. Whereas if they were in school, they may have had lunch there, but now they're in the shelter space and they were eating 3-4 times a day. Families were struggling, food shortages and everything else. And that's something we had to deal with through all of this. We had increase in hotline calls. There were, calling to ask, do we have shelter space, or just looking for the emotional support because now they were stuck at home with an abusive partner, where the space where a partner may have gone to work or they too have gone to work or have other relationships and family members to support them, that was far removed. And so we got, twice as many calls, just again, trying to work with people to see how we can ensure safety for them. Those are just some things through the pandemic that we know we will still continue to deal with as well. But when we talk about, the housing continuum, in the emergency shelter, Cecia said it's an emergency shelter. It's not a space for 2 years or 2 years living. It's a space where we can get people to safety, get them settled, get them access to meaningful resources. And then we say, well, how do you move on successfully? We know that stability is one of the highlighted things of why a survivor will return to their abuser. If they do not have housing, the chances of them going back is very likely. So when we say, well, we're asking you to make that phone call, to take this step, to take the leap of courage to leave your abusive situation. And then when they call the hotline, we say, well, we don't have shelter space because people are still there a year later. Or then they'll come to shelter and we don't have access to them leaving the emergency shelter. So we open up rooms for other people. Again, it goes back to, well, did I make the right choice? Did I do the right thing by leaving a situation where I knew I had a roof over my head and I was getting abused, and my children was getting abused, my pet was getting abused? But in that place, I knew I had some type of stability. The other struggle is really migrant family. I know you highlighted me being raised in Liberia, and for someone who is from Liberia, West Africa, being in a country where I understand, the immigration hurdles and so forth, you have families, migrant families, who again remain in abusive situation because funding is limited for migrant families to access stable housing. So oftentimes, we find families just being stuck in shelter with really little to no resources of where the next step will be. Those are just some things, again, like I said, the pandemic highlighted those things, but we will continue to face these issues. So thank you for having all of us here where we can share light to the community, constituents, to be able to know the work that we are doing.
Oh, thank you, Jessie. And Transition House, after touring there, was really the inspiration for the additional funding for shelter for survivors of domestic violence. So we're so grateful for your work and your model and example. And, you talked about an increase on domestic violence hotlines that you saw during the pandemic. We know that intimate partner violence has gone up. Are you concerned at all about the partner violence that we might not be seeing or hearing about because people are in such tight quarters? Can you talk about what you're seeing on the ground and whether you think we are experiencing underreporting of the violence that's happening?
Absolutely. We've always, there's always been underreporting of domestic violence. We know, I think Laura mentioned working with law enforcement, right? And I go back again to migrant families. We know if you have other hurdles that, if I were to report this or get the police involved, there are other things that will affect me as the victim reporting this. So that is already a barrier to reporting or a crime, to reporting abuse. That's that. But then also really when you look at someone calling to report or abuse or fleeing their abusive situation, where do I go? What are the resources that's available for me? We often ask survivors to make the trade-off. That trade-off is leaving an abusive situation. Now, I do want to highlight a leaving an abusive situation isn't always the safest. We do not advocate, we really advocate for safety planning, that if someone wants to stay in a relationship, how can we help you stay safe in that relationship? How do we help you stay safe if you're still in the home? But I can tell you this, during the pandemic, I answered a hotline call and there was a lady who she was sitting in her car. She sat in her car to make the call because the abuser and the children were upstairs in the house. We were on the phone. She wasn't looking to leave because she said, if I leave, where will me and my children go? She took that moment. It was about 3 minutes that she could make a call and say, I just need to figure out what do I do? How do I stay safe? And we couldn't get through the call because the abuser realized she was no longer in the house. And you could hear in the background, the abuser running to the car and asking, who are you talking to? And the call hung up. Those are the moments that we face on the hotline. Those are things that we hear. And again, if we're saying make the choice to seek safety, to seek resources, what are we really offering to families? Funding is always necessary. One of the things I do want to highlight through the pandemic, we've collaborated more with so many agencies. There's been so many collaborations and it's astounding. And I said, well, we've all been here, right? We've been here. We're still going to be here. How can we continue this? How can we, another partner agency has funding, another partner agency have shelter. We have a housing continuum with transitional living programs. If we open our doors, how can we get families that as well? How can we get funding to expand permanent supportive housing to families that we work with? But
yeah. Well, there were a lot of nodding heads to that collaboration. Does anyone else want to add to that?
I just wanted to briefly say, I think this is the importance of the wisdom of local community-based programs to be able to provide that kind of advocacy and outreach, right? It's that outreach piece that's so critical. And I think there's been so much creativity around how that outreach is done. And we're just so pleased here that our state legislature really invested in programs and advocacy and outreach during the last, even amidst the pandemic and the economic crisis posed by that, to really listen to that need for additional outreach and advocacy. It's critical because programs know how to reach the communities in which they sit, and that's powerful.
I want to build off of what Hema was saying, and Jess, thank you. Everything you said, just I think my nodding told the story. As a local program, I have colleagues who work very closely with survivors who are primarily immigrants who speak Spanish, and the trust over time that has been established by their efforts to partner with faith communities, with small businesses, with individuals, and to develop, to really support people in becoming lay advocates in their own community. That trust has, really enabled them to be a resource that can help information get from one place to another, can help resources get from one place to another, in such a way that it's efficient, it gets to the people who need it, it's timely. And I think that, to what Hema said, is so important as a local program. There are so many partners that we have in the community, and there's, our reputation. And so when something like this happens, it's really powerful to see the ways in which those trusted relationships can become so much more and can really make a difference for all of us in the midst of this really difficult time. And there is something powerful, I think, about the work that we do, and the idea that we want to create relationships in community that are respectful, that are supportive, that are mutual. We want to model what we're working for in this world, right? And so when the time came and the need was there even more urgently, we were able to build off of those really strong relationships and, do the work that needed to be done. Information about supporting teenagers for families who, who may not have access to some of the stuff that's out there that's in English. Information about taking care of your own health in the middle of the pandemic. Unfortunately, our advocates have helped people plan funerals in this environment. And then, when the vaccine came, how to talk to people about that. That's all been happening along with, the funding that's been available to help us keep people housed so that they can avoid eviction, even proceedings, because eventually that money's, going to have to come from somewhere. We've been doing food deliveries. We've been talking with people again about their technology and helping them improve the experience for their kids. We've been able to do all of that because of these relationships. And I think that's what's powerful about this advocacy role that we have. It's the one-on-one level that we do every day with survivors in the community. And it's also the systems level that we do, again, every day with those partner organizations, and also with our elected representatives.
I also wanted to add, so the pandemic has affected us, like all of us, if not most of us, in one way or another. And let's think about the trauma the survivors of intimate partner sexual violence have in their pocket, in their bags. So our basic needs were compromised for most people, and then you add the trauma. So how do you manage the daily life? Am I going to have enough food at the table? Am I going to be able to help my kids do their schooling? Am I be able to go to the shelter, like all of that? Or am I going to be able to make the mortgage, or the rent? Am I be able to go to my second job? All of that. And then think about the trauma the survivors of intimate partner and sexual violence have on them. And so that extra step, that extra hurdle that they have had to carry. And at times I felt that most people were not even dealing with the trauma because they didn't have the capacity to work on it. They were like, I just want to have food. I want to have electricity. I want to have heat. I want to have a safe housing. And so many people put their mental health to the side. And now I don't know a single person that's not emotionally affected by all of this. And again, like there's so many survivors that are finally getting some sort of time to work with their emotions, and still with the unknown, because we don't know when this is going to end. We don't know when we're going to have the vaccine. As a parent, I see my kids struggling. I'm wondering, what is it going to be the deficiencies academically? What are we going to see? Like, what are the emotional struggles of my 15-year-old? Like, so can you imagine a 15-year-old that was sexually assaulted or witnessed domestic violence or intimate partner and having to cope with their growing this year academically, emotionally, and then being sort of socially or physically isolated from their system, their friends, the people that could lift them up. So this is really hard. And in my opinion, it would be great for the community in general to know that there's a lot of services out there. We're all trying to do as much as we can. So we're still here for them. And to help them in the different process. If it's housing, we'll help you with housing. Is it mental health? We'll help you with mental health. Is it food? We'll help you with food. You don't have to get them all. We'll help you where you are and the need that you have right now.
And I want to echo when it comes to the mental health piece of it. We were in a meeting this morning that we do every other Thursday. The Laura is part of it. And we were talking about mental health and whether we can hire or should we hire counselors or kind of go outside and buy from our providers to be able to provide more of the counseling piece of it because of how, with COVID and everything else. But what it came out of the meeting was that in reality, the people are booked. There's a 6-month waiting list for even to be able to get counseling, even if in the hospitals, in different areas, they're booked. So that is a need that we're going to see. And I think that as we progress with the pandemic and everything, I wonder what's really going to come out and what we're really going to see when it comes to mental health. Yeah. Because I know that for my piece, this has been really hard. And I know that we have been going and we have been providing services. It's amazing how we have been able to organize ourselves. But in the back of your mind, you're like, oh my God, what is really happening here? That I'm really going to my house. How can I adapt?
It's important to acknowledge the impact on all of our colleagues, because all of our colleagues are not only supporting survivors of sexual and domestic violence, they are also dealing with their own challenges, as Katya enlightened, but and this is going on and on and on, and they're dealing with partner job loss, they're dealing with family illness and loss. And so, I think every chance I have, I just want to lift up the incredible work that all of these people, all of us are doing. And all of us strive for well-being. And we talk about trade-offs, we talk about stability, we talk about safety, we talk about this importance of connection. And that's stuff that we all need in order to have a shot at well-being. And earlier today, I think you talked about housing, housed, healthy, and hopeful. And I think so often people forget about that last part, hopeful, because there is something about being able to see to the other side, to be able to have hope, to be able to see a future. And, so often that's part of our work is standing with survivors and families and being their surrogate hope maybe for a little while as they rebuild their own. And so I think all aspects that we've talked about, the housing and access to health services, the hopeful part is just as essential. And I'm so glad that you include that on the list of what everybody needs and deserves.
Well, I am so grateful to all of you for providing us that hope. And it's such a key focus, not only the mental health of the families that you serve, but also of you all and your staff and the caretakers. You are consistently meeting the needs of people who are in the very toughest part of their lives and facing the hardest of circumstances. So that alone is difficult, but then we are, by our human nature, social creatures, and to do that in our own isolation is really, really tough. And I think, as Cecia said, we are going to see that in our school kids. We are going to see it really ripple throughout. So I'm glad to hear that you all are thinking of your own self-care because we are so grateful and counting on your continued ability to serve critical needs in our communities. And I wondered if you could, as you think about finally reauthorizing the Violence Against Women Act, what do you think on the federal level in Congress we should be looking at as some of the lessons that we can pull from this pandemic experience?
I have a couple of thoughts. One of them is prevention. I think Laura was mentioning earlier, we, at least from BARC's perspective, we have been providing services for 46 years. So we have been responsive for 46 years, and we're not close to ending sexual violence. So we need to take that extra step and focusing on preventing. And preventing should look like education, Healthy Youth Act, Congresswoman Clark is still pending. I know. And community accountability is about, we know the harm is done. It's like, how do we sustain, how do we lift communities in general? So they're not in a position where crime occurs, where they're in a position of having their basic needs not met. So prevention by education, by trainings, by outreach, by creating awareness, also by stigmatizing what domestic, intimate, and sexual violence is. So it's okay, well, it's not okay, but if it happened, like, here we are, we're going to believe you, we're going to support you, we're going to lift you up, and then creating systems. We need housing, safe and secure housing. We need to expand mental health. We need Latina, Spanish speakers. We need licensed clinicians to provide bilingual or monolingual, like Spanish, all languages, as many languages that we can, clinical services. We need access to food, job security, build communities. So we're all safe.
Thank
Then
you.
Katia gave the whole spectrum of all we really need. But two of it I just want to highlight. It's definitely building communities part, because when you're in an area, a neighborhood where there already exists structural violence, right? You have to worry about every day social justice, racial justice, and all of those things. You come to domestic violence and you're like, it's sort of, it's not undervalued, but you have all these other things to think about, and you're like, well, this is not, but we want people to be really that they can report being abused, right? We want people to know that they can pick up the phone and call. We want them to know, or they can also text, right? As times change, as the country change, as culture changes as well, all of the different tools that's available to survivors to say, oh, we have this, that space of meaningful access to resources. Well, you can't say, well, call us. Then you don't have a language person. You can't say, well, text us, and they don't even have minutes on their phone, or things like that. So really building communities, strengthening communities that people have access to resources. So when domestic violence is prevalent in the home, they know that it can also be just as important to them to making the choice of saying, I can report this, right? I'm not in fear that if I call the police on my partner who happens to be a person of color, there will be some other thing, some other racial justice issue that will occur. And so while I stay in an abusive situation, because that has more weight than my abuse, we don't want that. And again, that goes back to building communities. The second thing is the food. Food insecurity is really prevalent when, we see clients through our emergency shelter, through our transitional living programs. Just this year alone, every month at Transition House, we're spending almost $5,000 on gift cards to be able to provide supplements so that families do not go hungry. We know it's not enough, right? if you have a family of 3, really, what can $100 or $200 gift card do for you? Nothing. So we see that as well. There are times, I mean, every month we're spending on Instacart to make sure families, one who don't have access to get to the grocery store, we can also, again, make sure that they do not go hungry. So those things are very, very important. Survivors of domestic violence oftentimes feel as if they're sort of troubling somebody by asking for things that, you know, they should have access to. And I will tell you, often in shelter, I tell clients, you are troubling me by not asking. You're troubling us when we see you going through things and you don't speak up. We are here for you. There's a common thread with DB, this work that we do. We say we come to this work to heal. And so when you watch people in need and just really feel like, well, I don't want to ask because, and I don't want to ask because, and it's like, no, please do. That's why we are here. And that's why we come to this work, so we can make a difference. Transition houses, our mission is to break the cycle of violence in our communities. It's something every day we wake up to do. We know it's a hard battle, right? It might be a never ending battle, but we strive every day to break that cycle. And all the things that we build in communities, and food security are ways in which we can continue to break that cycle.
On that note of breaking the cycle, I think the other thing we have to pay attention to, and I think has come to light so much over the past years, is the use of abusive behavior. And, you know, abusive behavior is built on, you know, abusive values and how people have been socialized and how they have been impacted in their own lives, and the intersection with, you know, the supremacy and, you know, other movements and actions in this country, I think cannot be ignored. I mean, the fact that domestic violence is a pattern of behavior that one person uses to gain and maintain power and control over another person. And so that pattern must be interrupted and must be addressed in order for this cycle to truly be broken. And so I think paying attention to how, when, you know, especially prevention, when we're doing the kind of work that we're doing in community, building up this understanding of where accountability needs to come from and how we need to shift those behaviors and values and attitudes in order to truly break a cycle that, you know, as Katya says, you know, has continues and continues. And we were celebrating our 40th anniversary this year, and we have provided a lot of shelter, and we have gone to court a million times, I bet. And we have answered thousands and thousands and thousands of hotline calls. And the work that we're doing in prevention is a necessary complement to that, because if we aren't looking at, you know, how we're all learning in our life, then, you know, it's just we're going to just keep going to court, and we're just going to keep answering the hotline.
And we cannot do it alone.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
It's a community effort. We need to be able to involve everyone in our communities, and not just the domestic violence programs. This is everyone that we can involve to be able to change this and to break this pattern. And, you know, while Katya was talking about, I was just thinking about, this is human rights. It's just human rights. We're talking about food.
Absolutely.
Housing, permanent housing. We haven't even touched on immigration and the status of immigration, and that's and what that is. But this is only humans' rights that we're advocating for, that we're trying to get the response that we need to be able to support the community the way that we need to.
Yeah, I mean, I think going back to that piece around the culturally specific program funding, I mean, this is where this, in many ways, so many components of this movement that we are all part of came from the work of communities of color, under the leadership of folks of color doing this work to benefit their communities when system responses were varied, right? And I think that there is a wisdom of that. I think the integration that I'm hearing in this conversation of prevention education, of work with people who have caused harm, of addressing our own, you know, all of the isms that make their way into our own day-to-day practice and lives is because it is there in the air we breathe of, working with survivors in creative ways that respond to the myriad of challenges and approaches that they want to take in terms of healing. And I think this is there's such an opportunity to invest in those culturally specific program funding, in alternative solutions to supporting survivors to heal from trauma, whether it's exploring kind of restorative or restorative justice related approaches to this work as well as a complement to, not in lieu of, existing responses. There's so much there. Just wanted to also uplift, really strengthening. I think there's been some deep harm caused to immigrant communities over the past 4 years, certainly, and prior to, but to use an opportunity for our reauthorization to really strengthen the restore some aspects of trust that immigrant survivors can have with to access the services that they need by strengthening protections.
Yeah, well, thank you all. Our time has flown by here, but I asked you to sort of set out what you would think for VAWA and reauthorization around that, and you really set out an agenda for how we meet this moment in our country where we are facing such a physical threat that has brought to light all these inequities that we knew existed, and you've ticked right through them. And it really gets to the core of the work you do, which is in breaking the cycle of violence, in working to support survivors. You are touching on all the pieces that build strong communities and strong economy and a fairer and more just country and democracy. So your local work, this incredible work that you're doing, has such a tie-in to all of our work in Congress, in the Commonwealth, and in communities across the country for how we build a stronger country and democracy. And so we're grateful for your work at all times, but especially at this time. Thank you for setting out that blueprint of how each and every family can be successful and resilient. And just for the incredible moral clarity and incredible insight and work that you bring to your clients and to all of us every day. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you again for everything you do.